Matt Gaetz entered the House Judiciary Committee hearing room with the swagger of a man who believed he had already won. His pale blue suit caught the overhead lights as he settled into his chair, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, the expression of someone who had survived every scandal, every investigation, every headline that would have ended lesser careers. He leaned back, one hand draped casually over the armrest, projecting the ease of a man completely unthreatened by whatever the day might bring. Jasmine Crockett sat across the chamber perfectly still. Her navy blazer showed no wrinkles. Her hands, rested flat on the table surface, and centered precisely on either side of a single manila folder. The folder was unremarkable, standard government issue, perhaps an inch thick, with a small red tab visible at the top edge. She had not opened it yet. She had not touched it since placing it on the table 17 minutes earlier when she first entered the room. But something about the way she positioned herself in relation to that folder suggested she knew exactly what it contained and exactly when she would need it. The chairman gavelled the session to order. The hearing's stated purpose was oversight of Department of Justice prosecutorial discretion, dry procedural territory that promised little drama. Gaetz had requested time to speak first, a courtesy extended to senior members. He began without notes, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of someone who had delivered this speech or versions of it dozens of times before. Mr. Chairman, we're here today to discuss the weaponization of federal law enforcement against political opponents. And I think it's important we acknowledge what we're really talking about. We're talking about prosecutors with political agendas. We're talking about people who graduate from certain law schools, move to Washington, and suddenly believe they have the moral authority to decide which Americans deserve investigation and which deserve protection. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Several members shifted in their seats. Crockett remained motionless. Now, I know there are members of this committee who will disagree with me. Members who come from, let's call them more activist legal backgrounds. Members who perhaps attended schools where they were taught that the law is a tool for social engineering rather than a neutral framework for justice. His eyes moved deliberately toward Crockett's side of the chamber, though he did not look at her directly. And I respect their passion. I really do. But passion is not the same as experience. Ideology is not the same as understanding how the criminal justice system actually works in the real world, where real people face real consequences. The condescension was expertly calibrated and never explicit enough to draw like a formal objection, but unmistakable to everyone in the room. He continued for another 6 minutes, building a case that federal prosecutors had become partisan actors, that their discretion had been corrupted by political bias, that the American people deserved better than lawyers who treated the Justice Department as an extension of their personal political preferences. When he finally yielded his time, there was a murmur of agreement from his side of the aisle. He leaned back again, that smirk returning, satisfied with the foundation he had laid. Whatever came next, he had framed the terms. He had defined the battlefield. He had positioned himself as a defender of objectivity against activist overreach. Crockett's turn came 14 minutes later after 2 other members had spoken. She had not moved during the intervening time. The folder remained closed. When the chairman recognized her, she acknowledged him with a slight nod and then turned her attention fully to Gaetz for the first time. Mr. Gaetz, I appreciate your passion. Her voice was level, almost gentle. And I want to make sure I understand your argument correctly, because I think it's important we're precise about these things. You've suggested that some prosecutors bring ideological bias to their work, that they allow their political beliefs to influence their professional judgment. Is that a fair summary of your position? Inzati, and saying so, Gaetz spread his hands in a gesture of magnanimous agreement. I think that's exactly right, Ms. Crockett. And I'm glad we can have this conversation in a civil manner about these important. I'm glad too. She cut him off, but so smoothly it barely registered as an interruption, because I want to make sure we're operating from the same evidentiary foundation before we go any further. Her right hand moved to the folder, resting on its edge, but not yet opening it. You mentioned prosecutorial discretion being weaponized. You mentioned political opponents being targeted. Those are serious allegations. And I assume, given your background and your experience, that you wouldn't make those allegations without specific documented evidence to support them. Something flickered across Gaetz's face, not quite concern, but the first shadow of uncertainty about where this was heading. I think the evidence is all around us, Ms. Crockett. We see it in the cases that are brought and the cases that aren't. I'm going to stop you there. And she opened the folder. The sound of the paper tab releasing was somehow audible in the chamber's sudden quiet, because I want to talk about one specific case, one specific example of prosecutorial discretion, and I want to walk through it very carefully because I think it illustrates something important about how these decisions actually get made. She removed a single document from the folder, a memorandum, perhaps 6 pages, stapled in the upper left corner. Official Department of Justice letterhead was visible at the top. She did not hand it to anyone. She simply placed it on the table in front of her, oriented so she could read it easily. This is an internal DOJ memorandum dated March 17, 2021. It was written by a career prosecutor in the public integrity section. That's the division that handles corruption cases involving government officials. The prosecutor's name is redacted in the version I have, but that's standard for ongoing investigations. What's not redacted is the subject line. She looked up at Gaetz directly. Would you like me to read it? Gaetz's posture had changed. He was sitting straighter now, the casual lean gone. I'm not sure what you're referring to. The subject line reads, referral for potential violation of 18 U.S.C. 201B1, Gaetz, Matthew Lewis. She let that sit for a moment. For those not familiar with federal criminal code, that's the statute covering bribery of public officials, specifically the offer or receipt of anything of value in exchange for official acts. The room had gone completely still. Even the usual background noise, like the shuffling of papers, the whispered consultations between members and staff, it's Sao had ceased. Now, Mr. Gaetz, I want to be very clear about what this memo does and does not say. It does not allege that you committed a crime. What it does is document a referral that came to DOJ from another agency. The memo indicates it originated with the House Ethics Committee, though that's partially redacted, recommending that prosecutors evaluate whether there was sufficient evidence to open a formal investigation into certain payments you allegedly made to women between 2017 and 2019. She turned a page. The memo specifically references Venmo and Cash App transactions totaling $90,000 across a 14-month period. It notes that some of these payments were labeled with terms that, in the memo's language, suggest potential commercial sexual activity. Gaetz's face had gone from its usual slight tan to something paler. His hand gripped the edge of the table. That investigation was closed. No charges were ever. You're absolutely right. Crockett's voice remained calm, almost soothing, and no charges were filed. And that brings me to the reason I'm walking through this particular case, because I want to talk about prosecutorial discretion. I want to talk about how career prosecutors, the kind you've spent the last 20 minutes, maligning as politically biased, actually make these decisions. She removed a second document from the folder. This is the follow-up memo dated November 8, 2021. Same prosecutor, same case file. And this memo documents the decision not to pursue charges. She looked up again. Mr. Gaetz, do you know what the primary reason was? What factor the prosecutor cited as most important in deciding not to bring an indictment? Gaetz said nothing. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Crockett's left shoulder. The primary reason cited was witness credibility issues. Specifically, the memo notes that the two individuals who could provide direct testimony about the nature of the payments both had significant credibility problems. One had pending charges in an unrelated case. The other had made inconsistent statements in prior interviews. The prosecutor wrote, and I'm quoting directly here, while the transaction records establish that payments were made and while the Venmo labels are suggestive of illegal activity, the inability to corroborate the nature of those transactions through credible witness testimony creates reasonable doubt that we cannot overcome at trial. She closed the document carefully and placed it back in the folder. That, Mr. Gaetz, is what prosecutorial discretion actually looks like. A career prosecutor, someone with no political agenda that I can discern from these memos, looked at evidence that suggested possible criminal activity. They did not ignore it. They did not dismiss it. They evaluated whether they could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury. They concluded they could not, and so they declined to prosecute, not because of politics, not because of ideology, but because that is what professional prosecutors do when the evidence is insufficient to meet the legal standard required for conviction. The chamber was silent except for, for the faint hum of the ventilation system. Crockett let the silence hold for a moment, then continued. But here's what interests me about this case. Here's what I think is really instructive for this committee's work today. I see Nur and Nari see she removed a third document from the folder because that wasn't the end of the story. 6 weeks after the decision not to prosecute, the prosecutor who wrote that memo was contacted by your legal team. And according to this email chain, which I have here, your attorneys made a rather unusual request. She held up the printed emails, 3 pages stapled together, and they asked the prosecutor to provide a letter formally stating that you had been cleared of all wrongdoing, not just that charges wouldn't be filed, that's standard, but that you had been affirmatively cleared, that the investigation had exonerated you. Gaetz, and so Gaetz's voice was tight, and they declined that request, which is their prerogative. They did decline it, but what's interesting is why they declined it. Crockett read from the email, "We cannot provide a letter stating that Mr. Gaetz was cleared or exonerated because that is not an accurate characterization of our decision. We declined to prosecute due to evidentiary insufficiency, not because we concluded no wrongdoing occurred. Those are materially different determinations." And she looked up. But do you see the distinction, Mr. Gaetz? The prosecutor is saying that not having enough evidence to convict is not the same as being innocent. It's just not having enough evidence to convict. Mesa and, Zuri, she placed the emails back in the folder with the other documents. Now, you came into this hearing talking about weaponized prosecution, about political bias, about activist lawyers who use their positions to target opponents. But what I'm showing you is a case where prosecutors did exactly what they're supposed to do. They investigated a referral. They evaluated the evidence. They made a professional judgment that the case could not be won at trial. And when your team tried to spin that declination as exoneration, they refused to participate in that mischaracterization. That is integrity, Mr. Gaetz. That is what professionalism looks like in the criminal justice system. She paused, her hands resting flat on the table again, equidistant from the folder. But there's one more thing, one more piece of this that I think is important for this committee to understand. She opened the folder one final time and removed a 4th document, this one thinner, perhaps 2 pages. This is a memo from the same case file dated January 2022. 3 months after the decision not to prosecute. And it's marked supplemental evidence review, because here's what happened. After your legal team made their request for an exoneration letter, additional evidence came to light. Specifically, a witness who had not been interviewed in the original investigation came forward with information that corroborated some of the earlier allegations. The air in the room had changed. There was a tension now, a collective holding of breath. This witness, whose name is redacted, provided bank records showing that they received payments from an intermediary account and that those payments occurred on the same dates as your Venmo transactions to that intermediary. The witness also provided text messages that, according to the memo, established a direct connection between the payments received and specific dates of travel with Representative Gaetz. She looked up from the page. So the prosecutor had to make another decision. They had new evidence, not conclusive evidence, but new information that strengthened a case they had already declined to prosecute. What would you do in that situation, Mr. Gaetz? If you were a career prosecutor operating without political bias, trying to do your job with integrity, what would you do? This is Surrey, and it's Gaetz's mouth open, but no sound came immediately. His hand had moved from the table edge to his water glass, gripping it tightly enough that his knuckles had gone white. Let me tell you what this prosecutor did. Crockett's voice was steady, almost sorrowful. They wrote a memo documenting the new evidence. They consulted with their supervisor. They reviewed the original declination reasoning, and they concluded that while the new evidence was corroborative, it still did not overcome the fundamental witness credibility issues that had prevented prosecution in the first place. So they made the same decision again. They declined to reopen the case, not because of politics, not because they were protecting you, But because the evidence still was not sufficient to win at trial, she closed the folder for the final time. That's prosecutorial discretion, Mr. Gaetz. That's what you called weaponization. That's what you suggested was politically biased. But what I see in these memos is a prosecutor doing exactly what we should want prosecutors to do, following the evidence, applying consistent legal standards, making difficult judgment calls based on what can be proven in court, not what might be true. Even when new evidence emerged that, that could have justified reopening a politically sensitive case, they held to the same professional standard. They did not pursue a case they did not believe they could win, regardless of the political implications. She leaned forward slightly, her voice softening but losing none of its precision. So I want to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer. Given what I've just shared with you, given that these memos document prosecutors declining to charge you not once but twice based purely on evidentiary standards and not political considerations, do you still believe that federal prosecutors are weaponizing the justice system against political opponents? The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere in the back of the chamber, a photographer's camera shutter clicked once, then stopped. The court reporter's hands hovered over her stenotype, motionless. Gaetz's eyes had fixed on the closed folder in front of Crockett, as if the manila folder itself had become the most dangerous object in the room. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. His mouth worked soundlessly, trying to form words that would not come. 20 seconds. His press secretary seated in the gallery behind him leaned forward slightly as if willing him to speak, to say anything that would break this moment. 24 seconds of complete documented silence. Finally, his voice came, rough, defensive, nothing like the confident swagger of 20 minutes earlier. What I think is that this hearing was supposed to be about systemic issues, not about personal. I'm going to stop you again. Mr. Crockett's interruption was gentle but absolute, because that's not an answer to my question. My question was very specific. Do you still believe federal prosecutors are weaponizing the justice system against political opponents? Gaetz's face had gone through several colors, pale to flush to something approaching gray. I think there are instances where Mr. Gaetz, she did not raise her voice, but something in her tone commanded instant silence. I have just shown you documentation of prosecutors declining to charge you twice. I have shown you evidence that when your legal team tried to characterize that declination as exoneration, prosecutors refused to participate in that mischaracterization because it would be dishonest. I have shown you that even when new evidence emerged that could have justified reopening your case, they held to the same evidentiary standard. These are the prosecutors you spent 20 minutes attacking as politically biased activists. So I'm asking you again, do you still maintain that position? He reached for his water glass, took a sip that was more reflex than thirst, set it down with a hand that was noticeably unsteady. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely audible. I think we can all agree that there are areas where the system could use more transparency. It was not an answer. Everyone in the room understood it was not an answer. It was retreat dressed as deflection, and the retreat was unconditional. Crockett nodded slowly, as if accepting something she had expected. I appreciate your measured response. The words carried no sarcasm, but that their contrast with his earlier bombast was devastating. Because here's what I want this committee to understand. Here's what I want everyone watching this hearing to understand. Sansi and Sani Ambe, she placed her hand flat on the closed folder. Prosecutorial discretion is not about politics. It's about evidence. It's about witnesses. It's about what you can prove in front of 12 citizens who don't care about your political party or your media appearances or your Twitter following. It's about whether the evidence is sufficient to convince people who are required by law to presume you innocent until proven otherwise. Maxo is so anami, her voice took on a harder edge, though her volume never rose. And when you come into this chamber and attack career prosecutors as politically biased, when you suggest that they're weaponizing the justice system, when you imply that their professional judgments are driven by ideology rather than evidence, you're not just attacking them. You're attacking the entire framework of accountability that's supposed to make this system work. You're telling the American people that they can't trust the prosecutors who decline to charge you based on evidentiary insufficiency. Think about that. You're undermining faith in the very system that protected you. Gaetz had stopped trying to respond. His press secretary had her phone out, undoubtedly already trying to craft a response for social media that would attempt to reframe this moment, but there would be no reframing the 24 seconds. Video clips were already being marked by staffers, time-stamped, prepared for immediate distribution. You mentioned earlier that you respect passion, but that passion is not the same as experience. Crockett's voice had returned to that initial calm, the weaponized gentleness that made every word land harder. You suggested that some members of this committee come from activist legal backgrounds, and I think we both know you were talking about me. You implied that my law degree, my experience, my understanding of the criminal justice system is somehow less valid than yours because I care about social justice, because I believe the law should protect the vulnerable and not just the powerful. She paused, and in that pause was the entire weight of what was coming. But Mr. Gaetz, I'm not the one who needed prosecutors to exercise discretion in my favor twice. I'm not the one whose case file contains memos documenting why I wasn't charged with a federal crime. I'm not the one who tried to get prosecutors to write me an exoneration letter they refused to provide because it would be dishonest. And Zoris, her hands remain perfectly still on either side of the folder. You questioned my qualifications at the beginning of this hearing, but I'm not the one whose understanding of prosecutorial discretion is based on being the subject of it. I'm actually a lawyer who understands how evidence works, and that's why I came prepared with documents instead of rhetoric. The callback landed with the force of a closing argument. Gaetz' opening condescension in his casual dismissal of her credentials, his implication that she was all passion and no experience, all of it had been inverted and returned to him as proof of the opposite. He was the one who did not understand the system. He was the one operating from ideology rather than evidence. He was the one, whose experience with prosecutorial discretion came from needing it, not exercising it. The chairman, recognizing that no productive exchange would follow, thanked both members for their contributions and moved to recognize the next speaker. Gaetz' microphone clicked off. He did not immediately leave, but he also did not speak again. He sat in his chair, that manila folder still visible across the chamber, a physical reminder of everything he had survived and everything he had just lost. Crockett gathered her materials slowly, methodically. The folder went back into her portfolio with the same deliberate care it had been removed with. Her tablet was closed, her notes squared. When she finally stood to leave, her jacket still showed no wrinkles. She had not raised her voice once. She had not shown anger or satisfaction or anything other than the calm precision of someone who had done her homework and let the evidence speak. The video clip would be viewed 4 million times in the first 6 hours. The 24 seconds of silence would become its own separate viral moment, shared and reshared with captions ranging from "watch him die inside" to "this is what accountability looks like." But what gave the clip its deepest resonance was not the spectacle of Gaetz' collapse. It was the contrast. The calm black woman with her documented evidence, the bombastic white man with his deflections and his inability to answer a simple question, the lawyer who understood the system defending it against the politician who had benefited from it while attacking it. Crockett had not destroyed Gaetz' career. Like, the prosecutors who declined to charge him had seen to his survival, but she had done something potentially more lasting. She had taken his own talking points about weaponized prosecution and turned them into evidence of the opposite. She had shown that the system worked even when its target was powerful, even when the political pressure to prosecute might have been intense, even when new evidence emerged that could have justified reopening the case. The prosecutors had held to their standards. They had done their jobs. And in doing so, they had protected the very man who was now attacking them. That was the real story of the manila folder and the 24 seconds of silence. Not political theater, not partisan warfare, just the documented truth presented calmly, and the moment when someone with no good answer realized the whole room knew it.